I rescued an alien after a crash, and he showed me the truth about the Palace of David. I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you isn't fiction, fantasy, or the product of a fevered imagination. It's a testimony that has shattered and rebuilt everything I thought I knew about God's creation, about the vastness of His love, and about the ancient truths hidden beneath the sacred soil of Jerusalem. 3 months ago, I was driving alone through the Judean desert just before dawn, returning from a night of prayer at a monastery when the sky above me split open with a light so brilliant it turned the darkness into noon, and I watched something fall from the heavens like a wounded star, trailing fire and crystalline fragments that scattered across the sand like broken diamonds. My hands were trembling on the steering wheel as I followed the pillar of smoke rising in the distance, every instinct telling me to turn back, to call the authorities, to pretend I'd seen nothing. But something deeper pulled me forward, a voice. Without words, a knowing in my bones that this moment had been written into my life long before I was born. When I crested the final dune, I saw it. A vessel unlike anything human hands could craft, half buried in the sand, its surface neither metal nor glass, but something living, pulsing with dying light, like the last heartbeat of a fallen angel. I approached on foot, my boots sinking into sand, still hot from the impact, and as I drew closer, I could see through the translucent hull to the figure inside, a being slumped and broken, his form humanoid but wrong in ways my mind struggled to process, his skin emanating a faint luminescence that flickered like a candle in wind. And when our eyes met through that crystalline wall, I saw something that stopped my breath, ancient sorrow, profound loneliness, and a recognition that pierced straight through to my soul. The vessel was cracked open along one side, and I could hear a sound coming from within. Not quite breath, not quite song, but something between them, a resonance that made my chest ache and my eyes burn with tears I couldn't explain. I should have been terrified, should have run screaming back to my car and driven until the desert swallowed that impossible sight behind me, but instead I found myself pulling at the broken edges of the craft, ignoring the way it burned my palms with cold fire, dragging this wounded stranger from the wreckage as the eastern sky began to pale with approaching dawn. He was lighter than he should have been, his body radiating a heat that felt like standing near a furnace. And as I cradled him in my arms, I could see details that my rational mind wanted to reject. Skin that shimmered like oil on water, eyes too large and too deep, the color of desert twilight, and hands with fingers just slightly too long, ending in what looked like starlight beneath the skin. I loaded him into the back of my vehicle with a strength I didn't know I possessed, covering him with blankets even though his body seemed to generate its own warmth. And as I drove toward Jerusalem with this impossible passenger, I kept whispering prayers in Hebrew, in English, in tongues I'd never learned, begging God to show me what He wanted me to do, why He had placed this stranger, this alien, this angel, this creature of unknown origin in my path. The city was just waking as I pulled into the narrow street where I lived, and I managed to carry him inside unseen, laying him on the floor of my study, where morning light filtered through curtains, illuminating his form in gold and amber, making him look almost human, almost holy. For 3 days, I watched over him as he lay motionless, his chest barely rising and falling, that inner light growing dimmer with each passing hour, and I was certain he was dying, that I was witnessing the final moments of a being who had crossed unimaginable distances only to perish in a stranger's home, surrounded by books on theology and archaeology beneath a simple wooden cross on my wall. I tried to give him water, but his lips wouldn't open. I tried to clean his wounds, but my hands passed through something like resistance, like an invisible field that protected his body from my touch, and in my desperation, I did the only thing left to me. I prayed. I prayed with an intensity I'd never known before, kneeling beside this alien form, my hands hovering over his chest, asking God if this being was also his creation, if the universe was truly so vast that his love extended to worlds beyond our knowing, if the heavens declared his glory in languages we'd never heard and forms we'd never imagined. And then, on the third day, as afternoon light slanted through the window, something changed. His body began to glow brighter, not dimming but intensifying, light flowing through him like blood, like electricity, like liquid prayer, and patterns emerged on his skin, symbols that looked almost like Hebrew, but older, stranger, as if our ancient alphabet was just one dialect of a cosmic language. His eyes opened suddenly, fully, and locked onto mine, with an awareness so complete, so knowing that I felt naked before him, every secret, thought, every hidden doubt, every desperate hope laid bare in that gaze. And then he spoke my name. Not the name on my birth certificate, but another name, a true name I'd never heard before, but recognized instantly as my own, spoken in a voice that resonated in my sternum, in my skull, in the deepest chambers of my heart. I fell backward, scrambling across the floor, my back hitting the wall as my mind tried to reconcile what was happening. This being rising slowly to his feet, unfolding to a height just taller than human, his movements deliberate and careful, as if he were remembering how to inhabit physical form. He raised one hand, palm outward, in what I somehow understood was a gesture of peace, and when he spoke again, his mouth barely moved, but I heard him clearly, not with my ears, but inside my mind, the words forming in English, though I knew that wasn't the language he was truly speaking, some divine translation happening in the space between his thoughts and my understanding. "Keeper of questions," he said, and his voice carried harmonics that made my vision blur with tears. "I am not your enemy, and I am not a god. I am a watcher, a guardian set to walk among the stones where your people first learned to speak the name of the Most High. And I have fallen not by accident but by design, because there is something you must see, something hidden beneath the city. Of the king who danced before the ark, something that will change how your kind understands their place in the infinite tapestry of creation." I could barely breathe as he moved closer, his presence filling the room with that strange warmth, with the smell of ozone and frankincense, and when he placed his hand above my head without quite touching me, I felt the walls of my small understanding begin to crack open. Felt the possibility that everything I'd been taught about God's creation might be true, but incomplete, a single note in a symphony that stretched across galaxies, across dimensions, across eternities I couldn't fathom. And in that moment I knew with absolute certainty that my life had just been divided into before and after, into the man who lived in comfortable certainty and the man who would carry impossible truth. I stood frozen against the wall of my study as he withdrew his hand, and in the silence that followed, I became aware of changes in myself. My heartbeat had slowed to match some rhythm I felt emanating from him. My breathing had deepened until each inhalation seemed to pull in not just air but light itself. And when I looked down at my own hands, I could have sworn I saw faint traces of that same luminescence flickering beneath my skin like distant lightning. He moved to the window with movements that seemed almost like a dance, each gesture deliberate and filled with grace that spoke of bodies built for different gravity, different atmosphere. And as sunlight fell across his form, I could see the extent of his injuries more clearly, fractures in that shimmering skin that leaked not blood, but something like liquid starlight, burns that curved across his shoulders and chest in patterns that looked almost intentional, almost ritualistic. "You are afraid," he said without turning to face me, his voice still resonating in that space between hearing and knowing. "But your fear is wrapped in wonder, and that makes you worthy of what I must share, what I was sent to preserve until the time when human hearts grew large enough to contain it without breaking. I found my voice finally, though it came out hoarse and uncertain, asking him what he meant by watcher, what he meant by design. And when he turned back to me, his two large eyes reflected my own image in their depths, but somehow transformed, somehow luminous, as if he saw not just my physical form, but the eternal spark that animated it. The piece of divine breath that Genesis promised lived in every human soul. He moved closer again, and this time I didn't retreat, couldn't retreat, held in place not by fear, but by desperate hunger for understanding, for confirmation that the universe was stranger and more wonderful than our telescopes and theories had. It dared to imagine that the God I'd worshipped in stone churches and ancient prayers was vast enough to fill galaxies with his children, diverse enough to speak through forms that bore little resemblance to our own. My people have walked among yours since before you carved the first altar stone, since before Abraham looked up at stars and received a promise of descendants beyond counting, he said. And as he spoke, he raised both hands, and light began to pool in his palms, not harsh or blinding, but gentle as candlelight, warm as a mother's touch. We were sent by the one you call Elohim, the God of infinite names and infinite forms, to guard the places where heaven touches earth, where the veil between dimensions grows thin enough for prayers to pass through like songs through open windows. And one such place lies beneath the city of David, built by a king who knew secrets that have been buried under centuries of conquest and forgetting. I watched as the light in his hands began to take shape, forming images that hung in the air. Between us like living holograms, I saw Jerusalem as it must have appeared 3,000 years ago, smaller and simpler, built on hills that gleamed white under the Middle Eastern sun, and I saw a palace rising stone by stone, workers moving with purpose, under the direction of a young king whose face was radiant with vision. The images shifted and changed as he continued to speak, his voice layering over the scenes like narration over film. And I saw that same king as a shepherd boy on hillsides outside Bethlehem, tending flocks under stars that seemed closer then, brighter, more alive with possibility. And then I saw something that made my breath catch, lights descending from that ancient sky, vessels similar to the one I'd pulled him from, but larger, more radiant, settling in the fields like promises, taking physical form. David was chosen not just as a warrior or a poet, but as one who could perceive beyond the visible spectrum, who could hear harmonies that most human ears cannot detect, and to him was given knowledge, architectural designs for a chamber beneath his palace, a space constructed with materials and according to geometries that would allow it to function as a bridge, a doorway, a meeting place between your dimension and others, where the presence of the Most High manifests in ways your prophets called angels, called visions, called the very throne room of God. His words were washing over me in waves, each sentence crashing against the foundations of my understanding, eroding certainty, revealing bedrock truths I'd never suspected lay beneath my comfortable theology, and I found myself weeping without shame, tears streaming down my face as I witnessed this impossible revelation, this merger of faith and cosmos that my heart recognized as true, even as my mind struggled to accept it. The light images showed David receiving scrolls or tablets from beings of luminescence, studying star charts that mapped not just constellations, but pathways through space-time, learning songs whose notes corresponded to frequencies that could affect matter itself, could open doors that existed outside normal perception. When the images finally faded, dissolved back into formless light, and then disappeared entirely, he lowered his hands, and I saw that his wounds had begun to heal themselves, the fractures in his skin sealing as if time were reversing, the leaked light being drawn back into his body until he stood before me nearly whole, nearly radiant with recovered strength. "I have shown you memory," he said softly, and there was something like tenderness in his alien features, something that transcended species and spoke to the universal language of compassion that perhaps all of God's creatures shared, regardless of their origin. And now I offer you choice. You can release me to find my own way to the place I am called to protect, or you can journey with me into the depths beneath David's city, into the chamber that your archaeologists have excavated without understanding, and I will show you proof that will transform not just your life, but your species. Comprehension of its place in divine creation. I wipe my eyes with shaking hands, my mind racing through implications and impossibilities, through the danger of harboring this being and the greater danger of letting him go alone into a city filled with governments and militaries who would see him as threat or prize rather than messenger. And I heard myself saying yes before I'd consciously decided, heard my voice firm and clear, despite the trembling in my limbs, telling this watcher that I would go with him wherever he needed to travel, that if God had orchestrated our meeting, then I would trust that same God to see us through whatever lay ahead in the buried secrets of the city of David. He told me we would leave at dawn, and through that long night I sat wakeful in my study while he rested in what appeared to be meditation, his body positioned in a way that seemed to defy anatomy, limbs folded into geometries that should have been impossible but somehow looked perfectly natural for his form, and in the darkness I watched, the subtle glow that pulsed beneath his skin in rhythms that reminded me of breathing, of heartbeat, of all the silent songs that bodies sing to keep themselves alive across the countless variations of God's creative imagination. I found myself praying more deeply than I had in years, not the rote recitations I'd fallen into through habit and routine, but desperate conversations with the divine, asking for protection and wisdom, asking if I was fool or prophet to trust this being who'd fallen from the stars, asking what it meant that the God I'd worshipped in limited human understanding might be so much vaster, so much stranger, so much more wonderful than our doctrines and denominations had dared to claim. When first light finally crept through the windows, pale gold spreading across Jerusalem's ancient stones, visible from my apartment, he opened those enormous eyes and looked at me with what I can only describe as gratitude, as if my willingness to accompany him carried weight in whatever cosmic calculus governed the missions of watchers, and he rose in a single fluid motion that left me once again marveling at the differentness of him, the alien grace that marked him as clearly not of earth, yet somehow felt aligned with the same creative power that had shaped humanity in divine image, whatever that image truly encompassed across the infinite canvas of creation. We moved through the waking city like ghosts, him wrapped in robes I'd provided that concealed his form but couldn't quite hide the odd proportions, the way he moved with steps that seemed lighter than gravity should allow. And I led him through narrow streets I'd walked 1,000 times during my years of research, past markets, beginning to set up their morning wares, past pilgrims already queuing at holy sites, past the layers of history that pressed down on this city like geological strata, Ottoman and Crusader and Islamic and Roman and Herodian and Hasmonean, descending through centuries toward the bedrock of David's time. He said nothing as we walked, but I felt his attention scanning everything, processing with senses I couldn't imagine, and once, when a group of soldiers passed close by, I felt him do something, some subtle manipulation of perception that made them look straight through us as if we weren't there, as if he'd bent light or thought itself to create a pocket of invisibility, and my heart, hammered with the reality that I was walking with a being whose abilities blurred the line between science and miracle, between technology and the signs and wonders that Scripture promised followed those who carried divine truth. The excavation site appeared before us as the sun climbed higher, the City of David Archaeological Park with its layers of exposed foundations and interpretive signs explaining to tourists what scholars believed they were seeing. And he stopped at the entrance, his hand gripping my arm with surprising strength, those luminous eyes fixed on something beyond the visible as he whispered that we were standing above one of Earth's sacred nodes, one of the places where King David himself had walked with knowledge of heavens that most humans still couldn't conceive. He produced from within his robes a device that looked like crystal and metal merged into impossible unity, organic and technological at once, pulsing with its own internal light. And when he activated it with a touch, I saw the air around us begin to shimmer, reality itself seeming to flex and reveal hidden dimensions. And suddenly the ancient stones before us were glowing with symbols that hadn't been there moments before, or rather had always been there but invisible to normal human perception, written in characters that blended Hebrew letters with geometric patterns that hurt to look at, directly, as if they existed in more dimensions than my three-dimensional eyes were equipped to process. "This is the language of the covenant," he said, his voice trembling with emotion I hadn't heard from him before, something like awe or reverence that told me even he, ancient and travelled among stars, found this place holy, found this convergence of divine intention and human faith to be sacred ground that commanded respect. David learned it from my predecessors, the watchers who came to him in the fields when he was young and pure of heart, when his soul was open enough to receive instruction that would terrify the proud and learned, but could be grasped by a shepherd boy who loved God with totality that made him capable of containing mysteries without being consumed by them. And he encoded these symbols into the foundation of his palace, marking the entrance to the chamber that lies below, the space that was built according to blueprints that came from beyond your world, but were always meant for humanity's elevation, for your species' graduation into a larger community of consciousness that spans galaxies and dimensions, and all exists within the infinite mind of the one who spoke everything into being. I reached out with shaking fingers to touch one of the glowing symbols, and felt it warm beneath my hand, felt it pulse with something like recognition, and in that instant I experienced a flash of vision so intense it nearly dropped me to my knees. I saw David as clearly as if he stood before me, young and beautiful and radiant with purpose, kneeling in this exact spot 3,000 years ago, his hands pressed to stones not yet weathered by time, his voice lifted in songs that were simultaneously prayers and activation codes, frequencies that resonated through dimensions and opened pathways between the throne room of God and this small patch of earth he'd been given to rule. The vision expanded, and I saw the chamber beneath us, as it had been when newly constructed, walls lined with materials that seemed to shift between solid and luminous, inscribed with more of those multidimensional characters, and at its center stood something like an altar, but also like a doorway, a focal point where heaven and earth kissed, where the prayers of the righteous could rise like incense and receive response, not as distant divine whim, but as genuine communication between creator and creation, between the infinite consciousness that dreamed the universe into existence and the finite minds struggling to comprehend their place within that vast dream. When I returned to myself gasping, the watcher was supporting me with hands that felt warm despite their strangeness, and he was speaking softly, telling me that what I'd experienced was just the faintest echo of the truth that waited below, that if I truly wished to continue this journey, I would see and know things that could never be unknown, would carry burdens and blessings that would mark the rest of my days. And I looked into those alien eyes and saw reflected there the same love I'd always believed shone from the face of Christ, the same compassion that transcended form and species. And I told him again with certainty that had become unshakable that I would follow wherever this path led, that if God's truth was stranger and more wonderful than I'd imagined, then I wanted to know it fully, wanted to be transformed by it completely, wanted to become a witness to the reality that humanity was not alone in divine love, but part of a cosmic family, too beautiful and too vast for our small theologies to have yet encompassed. The watcher placed his hand against the glowing symbols, and I watched as his fingers moved in patterns that seemed less like touching and more like conducting, drawing invisible currents from the stone itself, and he turned to me with an intensity that made the air between us feel charged with purpose, telling me that to understand the chamber, we would need to understand David, need to see him not as the sanitized figure of Sunday school lessons or the warrior king of historical record, but as he truly was, a bridge builder between worlds, a soul prepared from childhood for a destiny that would echo through millennia. He asked if I was ready to see, and before I could fully process the question, his hand was on my forehead, cool and firm, and the world dissolved into brilliance that reformed into a hillside green with spring grass, the smell of sheep and wildflowers filling my senses so completely, I forgot for a moment that this was vision and not present reality. And there on a boulder sat a boy no more than 12 or 13, his face turned skyward with an expression of such pure wonder that it made my heart ache with recognition of what faith looked like before religion complicated it. The sky above him began to shimmer exactly as I'd seen the air shimmer when the watcher activated his device, and 3 figures descended on pillars of light that bent the stars around them. And even in this vision, that was somehow also memory, somehow recorded in the very stones beneath the ancient city, I could feel the shock and awe radiating from young David, could feel him trembling not with fear, but with overwhelming joy, that the God he'd sung to in his solitary shepherd's watches was answering not with silence, but with emissaries, with proof that heaven heard and heaven cared, and heaven was so much more populated and active than anyone in his small world had imagined. The visitors, watchers like the one who now showed me this scene, knelt before the boy in a gesture of respect that seemed to astonish him, and the tallest of them spoke in that same language I'd heard in my apartment, words that resonated in the soul rather than the ear, explaining that they'd been observing his prayers, that the songs he composed in the wilderness rose through dimensions, like sweet incense, that the Creator of all things had marked him for a purpose that would require wisdom beyond his years, and faith beyond his culture's current comprehension. I watched as young David listened with tears streaming down his face, not tears of sorrow, but of recognition, as if everything he'd sensed in his deepest communion with God was being confirmed and expanded. And when the watcher showed him images, projections of light that displayed buildings and geometric patterns and symbols that blended earthly and celestial, the boy didn't recoil in confusion, but leaned forward with hungry intelligence, asking questions that revealed a mind capable of grasping concepts that would have broken lesser souls. They taught him through that long night, and I experienced it as if I'd been there, felt the hours pass, as they explained that God's temple was not meant to be mere stone and gold, but a functional apparatus, a meeting place designed with principles that governed how consciousness and matter interacted, how prayer and intention could be amplified and directed, how a properly constructed sacred space could serve as an anchor point where divine will could flow more freely into earthly reality, blessing not just Israel, but radiating outward to all nations, to all worlds, to the entire intricate web of life that filled God's creation. The vision shifted forward in time, and I saw David years later, no longer a shepherd but not yet king, sitting in firelight with parchment spread before him, his hands moving with careful precision as he drew architectural plans that were simultaneously practical and mystical, measurements and materials annotated with those multidimensional symbols the watchers had taught him. And I understood with sudden clarity that the Psalms everyone knew and loved were only part of his legacy, that encoded within his worship songs were frequencies and ratios, mathematical relationships that corresponded to the structure he was planning, that music and architecture and prayer were all different expressions of the same divine language he'd been taught to speak fluently. I saw him later still, crowned and powerful, overseeing construction of his palace with a section that was built to different specifications than the rest, hidden chambers that his own workers didn't fully understand, incorporating materials that the watchers had helped him locate, stones that responded to sound and intention, metals that conducted not electricity, but something more subtle, the very energy of focused consciousness aligned with divine will. The vision showed me the completion ceremony, David alone in the hidden chamber, his voice lifted in a psalm I'd never read in any scripture, words that made the walls themselves respond with light, that opened something in the fabric of reality so that for a moment the barrier between heaven and earth became transparent, and I saw angels and watchers together, beings of light and beings of form, all serving the same Creator, all celebrating this small triumph of human and celestial cooperation, this proof that God's children on earth were ready to take their place in a larger cosmic family. When the vision released me, I was on my knees in the dust of the excavation site, my face wet with tears I didn't remember shedding, and the Watcher was kneeling beside me with his hand still on my shoulder, his own luminous eyes reflecting what looked like stars in their depths, and he said quietly that what I'd seen was the truth that powers on earth had spent millennia trying to bury. Not because it contradicted faith, but because it expanded faith in ways that threatened those who wanted to control and limit rather than liberate and elevate. And I understood then, with devastating clarity, that the God I'd worshipped was so much bigger than I'd imagined, that Jesus himself had spoken of his Father's house having many rooms, that perhaps those rooms were not metaphorical but literal across dimensions and worlds, that divine love was the universal constant binding all consciousness together in service of the one who'd spoken galaxies into existence while still caring enough about a shepherd boy's prayers to send teachers from the stars. The fragment of crystal the Watcher wore around his neck pulsed with light that synchronized with the glowing symbols on the stones, and he told me that what lay beneath us was not just archaeological treasure but functional technology, spiritual machinery that could still serve a purpose if properly activated, and that we were about to descend into the very chamber David had built, to stand where kings and prophets and celestial visitors had once gathered in fellowship that honored both heaven and earth. And I rose on shaking legs, overwhelmed and exalted and terrified and grateful all at once, knowing that my life had already become something I could never have imagined, knowing that whatever came next would demand everything I had to give. The Watcher moved toward the excavation site with a grace that seemed wrong for someone his size, his footsteps making no sound on the ancient stones, as if he weighed nothing at all, and I followed with my heart hammering so hard I thought it might crack my ribs, my mouth dry as the desert dust that coated everything in this place where layers of history pressed down upon each other like pages in God's own book. He paused at the edge of the dig where archaeologists had exposed sections of what they believed was King David's palace, running his long fingers through the air above the stones without actually touching them. And I saw his device, the crystalline object he'd pulled from within his garment, begin to emit a soft hum that I felt in my teeth and sternum, a vibration that seemed to resonate with something buried deep in the earth beneath us. The afternoon sun blazed overhead, but the light around him took on a different quality, refracting through the device in ways that made my eyes water when I tried to focus directly on it, and he turned to me with an expression that held both sorrow and hope, telling me that what I was about to see had been hidden not by time's passage, but by deliberate design, that David himself had encoded protections into these stones that would keep their secrets safe until the right consciousness came seeking with pure intention. I wanted to ask what made me worthy of this revelation when thousands of scholars and pilgrims had walked these grounds without seeing. But the question died on my lips as he activated the device fully, and the world transformed before my eyes into something that looked like neither past nor present, but some eternal now, where all moments existed simultaneously. The stones themselves began to glow with symbols that weren't carved into them, but seemed to exist within them, or perhaps upon some layer of reality that human eyes simply couldn't perceive without assistance, flowing script that moved and shifted like living things. Hebrew letters intertwined with geometric patterns I recognized from my vision of young David receiving instruction from celestial teachers, and the beauty of it struck me so powerfully that I gasped aloud, tears springing to my eyes without permission. The watcher knelt beside a particularly large foundation, stone, and gestured for me to do the same, his voice soft as wind through grass as he explained that what I was seeing was the original blueprint still resonating in the material itself, that David had worked with stones that were prepared through processes combining prayer and technology, human faith and celestial knowledge, creating something that existed simultaneously as physical structure and spiritual antenna. I reached out with trembling fingers to touch one of the glowing symbols and felt warmth pulse through my hand, up my arm, directly into my chest, where it bloomed into emotion so overwhelming I couldn't name it. Wasn't joy exactly, wasn't peace exactly, but something that encompassed both and more, a feeling of coming home after an exile I hadn't known I was suffering. The watcher watched me with those ancient eyes and nodded slowly, telling me that what I felt was the echo of David's intention still embedded in these stones, his prayers pressed into matter through focused will aligned with divine purpose, and that this was the secret the world had forgotten, that consciousness and creation were never meant to be separate, that sacred architecture was supposed to be functional, not merely symbolic, designed to facilitate actual connection between earthly and heavenly realms. He moved the device in a circular pattern above the excavation floor, and the symbols brightened into constellations that mapped not just these visible stones, but suggested structures extending deep beneath us, chambers and passages that official archaeology hadn't discovered because they'd been looking with tools that could only measure physical displacement, never imagining that spiritual density might also require excavation. And I understood with sudden electric certainty that we were standing above something that had waited 3,000 years for this moment. The watcher's voice took on urgency as he explained that the chamber beneath us was designed as a bridge point, a place where the dimensional barriers were intentionally thinned through David's understanding of cosmic principles, where prayer offered with knowledge of these frequencies could be amplified and transmitted not just to God's throne, but throughout the network of conscious beings who serve the Creator across all his infinite domains. I thought of every prayer I'd ever whispered in darkness, every desperate plea and grateful thanksgiving, and wondered how many had been heard not just by God, but by a vast communion of celestial witnesses who cared about humanity's struggles and triumphs, who'd been watching and hoping and sometimes helping in ways we'd attributed to coincidence or miracle without understanding the infrastructure of grace that connected all things. He showed me how certain symbols corresponded to specific frequencies in David's Psalms, pulling out a small device that played tones that made my bones resonate, explaining that ancient worship wasn't primitive superstition, but sophisticated technology of consciousness, that the watcher held the tone device steady and its frequencies washed over me like waves of invisible light, each note striking something deep in my cellular memory that recognized these sounds as language older than words, and I suddenly understood with crystalline clarity that David's Psalms were never meant to be merely read or sung, but activated, that each verse contained layered meanings, accessible only when vibrated at specific frequencies that aligned human consciousness with celestial awareness. He spoke softly as the tones continued, explaining that the ancient king had been taught by his celestial visitors how sound itself was the fabric from which God had woven reality, that the divine utterance, "Let there be light," was not metaphor but literal description of creation through intentional frequency, and that humans made in God's image possessed the same capacity to speak things into existence when their words carried the proper resonance of faith combined with knowledge. I watched as the symbols glowing in the stones began pulsing in rhythm with the tones, creating patterns that reminded me of heartbeats or breathing or the way waves lap against shore, and I realized I was witnessing the chamber responding to its activation sequence, recognizing after 3,000 years of silence the specific frequencies that David had encoded as keys to unlock what he'd built. The watcher's expression held such reverence as he worked, such careful attention to each note's duration and intensity, that I understood this was sacred labor to him, that he approached this ancient human architecture with the same awe I might approach his alien technology, both of us standing in the presence of something that transcended our separate origins to touch the universal truth, binding all creation. He turned to me with eyes that seemed to hold entire galaxies in their depths, and asked if I understood what prayer truly was, not waiting for my stammered answer, but continuing in that voice like distant thunder, telling me that every sincere prayer ever uttered by human lips created actual vibrations in the dimensional fabric, ripples that spread outward from Earth, through planes of existence where consciousness itself was the primary substance, reaching not into empty void, but into populated heavens where beings of light served as God's ministers and messengers throughout his infinite domains. I felt my throat tighten with emotion as he explained that the chamber beneath us was designed to amplify these prayer frequencies, to take the desperate whispers of broken hearts and the grateful songs of delivered souls, and broadcast them with such clarity and power that they resonated across creation, that David had understood something modern humanity had forgotten in its reduction of faith to mere belief, that worship was meant to be participatory technology, allowing finite beings to consciously connect with the infinite presence that sustained all reality. The tones from his device shifted to a new pattern, and I heard within them something that sounded almost like singing. Voices harmonizing across octaves no human choir could reach, and the watcher told me these were recordings of David's own voice, preserved in crystalline memory, the shepherd king who'd killed giants and united kingdoms, but considered his greatest achievement to be this chamber where heaven and earth could meet in tangible communion. I thought of Jesus teaching his disciples to pray, telling them that their words had power, that faith, the size of a mustard seed, could move mountains. And I wondered if he'd known about this place, if he'd walked above these hidden chambers during his earthly ministry and felt their dormant potential humming beneath his feet, waiting for the age when humanity would be ready to reclaim its heritage as bridge builders between worlds. The ground beneath us began to vibrate with a frequency I felt in my bones rather than heard, and dust rose from between the ancient stones as something deep below responded to the watcher's activation sequence, and he looked at me with sudden urgency, telling me that the chamber was opening itself, that it recognized the combined intention of human and celestial, consciousness working in harmony for revelation rather than conquest, for understanding rather than exploitation, and that this was precisely the condition David had set as prerequisite for access. I saw fear flash across his luminous features for the first time since I'd pulled him from the crashed vessel. Not fear of the chamber itself, but fear of what would happen when others detected what we were doing, when the signatures of this awakening ancient technology reached instruments and attention we were not prepared to face. And he gripped my shoulder with surprising strength, telling me that what came next would require courage of a kind I'd never needed before, the courage to stand for truth when authority demanded silence, to protect mystery when power demanded explanation. The symbols in the stones blazed brighter, and I felt heat rising from below, not the heat of fire but of concentrated energy, of potential becoming actual, and I understood with terrible clarity that we'd crossed a threshold from which there could be no retreat, that the moment the chamber opened fully, everything would change. For me, certainly, but possibly for the world, because some secrets once revealed can never be hidden again, no matter how desperately institutions might try to stuff them back into darkness. He knelt and pressed his palm flat against the central foundation stone and sang in a language that made my heart ache with inexplicable longing, a melody that seemed to contain every beautiful thing I'd ever experienced and every beautiful thing I'd only imagined. And the stone beneath his hand suddenly wasn't solid anymore, but translucent, revealing stairs descending into luminous depths that glowed with soft golden light that breathed and pulsed like something alive. And I knew without being told that this was it. This was the bridge David had built between human prayer and cosmic reality, the place where faith became visible, and the invisible realm pressed so close to our material world that the barrier between them was thin as a whisper. The Watcher stood and extended his hand to me, his alien features arranged in an expression I recognized as profound respect, telling me that no human had stood in this place since David's own son Solomon had sealed it following his father's instructions, that I was being offered a gift beyond price, the chance to see with my own eyes what prophets and mystics had only glimpsed in visions, to understand that God's love for humanity expressed itself not just in spiritual promises, but in actual infrastructure of grace, technology of redemption that spanned worlds and dimensions, all designed to ensure that no sincere cry for help ever went truly unheard in the vast cosmos. I heard the vehicles before I saw them, the grinding of heavy tires on ancient stone echoing through the excavation site, and the Watcher's head snapped upward with an expression of resigned sorrow, as though he'd known this moment was inevitable from the beginning. And when I turned, I saw them emerging from between the reconstructed walls like shadows given substance, armed soldiers in tactical gear moving with practiced efficiency to form a perimeter around us, while men in dark suits followed behind, their faces hard with the kind of authority that brooks no questioning. The Watcher pulled me closer to the opening in the stone, positioning himself between me and the approaching forces, and I felt his body tense with energy I couldn't see but could sense crackling just beneath his skin, and he whispered that they'd been tracking his biosignature since the crash, that every government with satellites had detected the dimensional tear his vessel made entering Earth's atmosphere, and now they'd triangulated his location through equipment monitoring gravitational anomalies and electromagnetic disturbances. My heart hammered against my ribs as spotlights blazed to life, pinning us in circles of harsh white radiance that made the Watcher's luminous skin seem to glow even brighter, and a voice amplified through speakers demanded in 3 languages that we step away from the excavation and put our hands where they could be seen, the tone carrying that particular blend of fear and aggression that comes when those accustomed to control encounter something beyond their paradigm. I realized in that suspended moment that I stood at a crossroads, not just of personal choice, but of cosmic significance, that what I did in the next few breaths would determine whether the truth the Watcher carried remained hidden for another age, or whether humanity would be forced to confront the reality that our sacred texts described literal events witnessed and recorded by those who understood the universe more deeply than our modern skepticism allows us to imagine. The Watcher looked down at me with those eyes like dying stars, and asked me directly what I believed, not about him or his people, but about God, about whether I truly trusted that the Creator who spoke worlds into existence would guide us even in circumstances that seemed impossible. And I found myself answering from a place deeper than conscious thought that I believed God's ways were higher than our ways, that he worked through means we couldn't predict or control, and that if the divine wanted this truth revealed, then no army of men could ultimately prevent it, no matter how many weapons they carried. Something shifted in the Watcher's expression, a relaxation of tension around his eyes, and he told me that my faith was the key he'd been waiting for, that the chamber would only open fully for those who approached it, not as conquerors seeking power, but as humble seekers willing to let truth transform them, regardless of personal cost, and that my willingness to stand with him despite the danger proved I possessed the quality of heart that David himself had shown when he danced before the ark with complete abandonment to divine presence. The soldiers were advancing now in coordinated formation, their weapons raised but not yet aimed directly at us, clearly uncertain how to proceed with a situation their training manuals had never covered. And I could hear urgent communications crackling through their radios, multiple voices, demanding status updates and issuing contradictory orders that revealed the confusion rippling up through command structures, unprepared for first contact, happening not in controlled laboratory conditions, but at the foundation of their own civilization's most sacred history. The Watcher raised one hand in a gesture that was simultaneously peaceful and commanding, and he called out in perfect English that he meant no harm to anyone, that he was a guardian of holy sites across the universe and had come to this place specifically because what lay beneath these stones was too precious to remain lost, and I heard genuine compassion in his voice, even as he addressed those who would capture or kill him, as though he understood their fear and forgave it before they even acted on it. The lead agent stepped forward, a woman with grey streaking her pulled-back hair and eyes that had clearly seen too much to be easily surprised, and she spoke with careful control, saying that whatever he was, and whatever he thought he'd found here, this was a matter of national and international security that couldn't be resolved through unauthorized excavation. And I watched her gaze flick between the glowing symbols in the stones and the opening that led down into impossible depths, saw the conflict playing across her features between duty and wonder, between the orders she'd received and the evidence before her eyes that the universe was larger and stranger than any briefing had prepared her to accept. The Watcher addressed her by name, though no one had spoken it, a small demonstration of knowledge that made her stiffen. And he told her that she'd been searching her whole life for proof that human existence meant something beyond randomness and decay, that her secret prayers whispered in darkness after traumatic missions had reached farther than she knew, and that she stood now at the threshold of understanding that those prayers had been heard by the God she'd almost stopped believing in, that his angels took forms she'd never imagined, but their purpose remained constant. Across all creation, I saw her hand tremble slightly where it rested near her weapon, saw moisture gather in her eyes, though her expression remained professionally neutral, and the Watcher continued in that voice like distant music, saying that he could surrender himself to her authority and let his technology be seized and studied, and eventually weaponized. Or she could choose to witness what lay below and carry that knowledge forward, not as classified intelligence, but as living testimony that faith and reason weren't enemies, but partners in discovering the fullness of divine truth. The moment stretched between them like a bridge made of pure possibility, and I realized I was holding my breath, that everyone present had gone utterly still, even the wind seeming to pause, as though creation itself waited to see whether fear or courage would determine what happened next, whether humanity would greet its cosmic neighbors with weapons or with wonder. The woman's radio crackled, with an angry voice demanding she secure the asset. Immediately, but she reached up and switched it off, never breaking eye contact with the Watcher, and she said quietly that she joined military service originally because she believed in protecting sacred things, and she'd spent decades watching bureaucrats and politicians reduce every mystery to strategic advantage. But she was tired of living in the world where everything holy had to be locked away or denied or twisted into tools of control. She holstered her weapon and told her team to stand down, her voice carrying absolute authority, and though some of them shifted uncomfortably, they obeyed, and I felt tears streaming down my face at the courage of her choice, at the way Grace had moved through impossibility to create an opening where none should have existed. The Watcher extended his hand to her as he had to me, including her in the circle of those who would descend together into David's chamber, and she stepped forward on legs that looked unsteady but determined, and I understood that we were witnessing something unprecedented, that human and celestial were choosing trust over suspicion, that in this small moment, beneath Jerusalem's ancient stones, the kingdom of heaven was pressing through into material reality, just as Jesus had always said it would. The watcher looked at both of us with profound gratitude and began to sing again in that language beyond. Language, and the luminous stairs descended deeper into golden light that seemed to pulse with welcome, and together the three of us crossed the threshold into mystery, while above us the world continued in its familiar patterns, unaware that below its surface the truth it had always suspected but never proven was revealing itself to those brave enough to see. The descent felt endless, though it probably lasted only minutes, our footsteps echoing on stairs that seemed carved from solidified light rather than stone, each step singing beneath our weight with harmonics that resonated in my chest cavity like the lowest notes of an organ, and the air grew warmer as we went deeper, not with the stuffiness of enclosed spaces, but with a quality of aliveness I'd only ever felt in rare moments of profound worship, when heaven seemed to press so close you could almost touch it with outstretched hands. The walls around us were no longer the familiar limestone of Jerusalem's bedrock, but something crystalline and luminous, shot through with veins of gold that pulsed rhythmically as though the chamber itself possessed a heartbeat. And I realized with a shock of recognition that the rhythm matched my own pulse, that somehow this ancient structure was responding to our presence, acknowledging us as we entered its sacred space. The watcher moved ahead with reverent slowness, his luminous form reflected and multiplied in the crystalline surfaces until it seemed we walked surrounded by angels. And he murmured that this chamber had been waiting for millennia, held in temporal suspension by technology his people had given to David. Technology that looked like magic to ancient eyes, but was simply a more complete understanding of how the Creator had structured reality at its deepest levels. The agent beside me reached out tentatively to touch the wall and gasped as images bloomed beneath her fingers, scenes of King David as a young man kneeling on a hillside, while beings of light descended in vessels that moved like living things, and I saw tears tracking down her weathered face as she witnessed what had been hidden from official history, what had been relegated to myth and legend, but was here preserved in perfect clarity, undeniable evidence that the sacred texts told literal truth, even when that truth seemed impossible to modern minds, conditioned to see matter and spirit as separate realms. We emerged into a vast, circular chamber whose dimensions seemed to shift when I tried to focus on them. The ceiling soaring into darkness, punctuated by points of light arranged in constellations I recognized from Earth's night sky, but also patterns I'd never seen, star maps from perspectives impossibly distant from our small blue world, and the watcher explained in hushed tones that this was a navigation chamber, a place where the boundaries between physical location and spiritual reality grew thin enough to traverse, where prayer could literally move through the fabric of space-time to reach the throne of the Almighty, whose presence permeated all dimensions simultaneously. The walls were covered in script that made my eyes water to look at directly, Hebrew letters I could almost read, intertwined with symbols that seemed to writhe and reconfigure themselves, alive with meaning that existed beyond mere linguistic communication, and the watcher touched a sequence of these glowing characters, and the entire chamber responded, light cascading down the walls in waves that carried information I could feel more than understand, downloads of knowledge pressing against my consciousness like water against a dam. The agent was turning slowly in place, her professional composure completely dissolved, and she whispered brokenly that she'd spent her entire career protecting secrets when the greatest secret of all had been here beneath the city she'd been stationed in for 3 years. That everything she'd thought she knew about the universe and humanity's place in it was being rewritten with every breath she took in this impossible space. The watcher gathered us both close and told us to quiet our minds, to let our spirits perceive what our intellects couldn't process, and I felt him doing something I can only describe as tuning our consciousness the way you'd tune a radio, adjusting our frequency so we could receive what the chamber wanted to show us. And suddenly the air before us shimmered, and I was no longer sure if I was seeing with my physical eyes or perceiving through some deeper faculty I'd never known I possessed. A figure materialized in the center of the chamber, not solid, but not exactly holographic either, composed of light that had weight and presence, and I recognized him instantly, though I'd only ever seen artistic representations, the strong features and intense eyes of David the King, younger than his later years, but with an authority that needed no crown to proclaim itself, and he began to speak in ancient Hebrew that I shouldn't have understood but did, the Watcher's gift of comprehension extending to this preserved message from 3,000 years past. David's recorded words filled the chamber with resonance that vibrated in my bones. And he spoke of nights on the hills of Bethlehem when he'd seen the heavens open and beings descend who told him of the Creator's plan that spanned not just earth, but countless worlds, each one loved with the same fierce devotion that had led the Almighty to walk among us in flesh, to experience limitation and suffering, so that every created being, across infinite creation, could know they were not abandoned to meaninglessness, but held in eternal purpose. He described how these messengers, whom he called the host of heaven, had shown him that the temple he would plan and his son would build was meant to be more than a dwelling place for the ark, that it was a tuning fork meant to resonate with the fundamental frequency of divine presence, a technology of worship that could literally thin the veil between heaven and earth when activated by hearts fully surrendered to God's love. David's luminous form turned to look directly at us across the millennia, and he said with profound intensity that he was leaving this message for those who would come after, for the generations who would forget how to see angels in their midst, who would mistake their own isolation for sophistication and their loneliness for enlightenment. And he wanted them to know that they were not alone, had never been alone, that the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob was also the God of worlds beyond counting, and that the same love that had chosen Israel to carry his covenant was the love that bound together all conscious beings in a communion that transcended species and biology and even physicality itself. The message began to fade, but not before David spoke one final declaration that struck my heart like a bell, saying that a time would come when the Son of Man would return not to condemn, but to gather all the scattered children of God from every corner of creation, when earth would take its place in a cosmic family it had always belonged to, but had forgotten through fear and pride, and that those who kept faith through the long night of forgetting would be the bridges who helped humanity cross from isolation into its true inheritance as beloved children of the Most High, whose kingdom had no borders and whose grace had no limits. The Watcher was weeping openly now, luminous tears tracking down his face, and he told us that his people had been waiting for this moment, for humans who could witness these truths without their minds breaking or their hearts closing, who could hold the tension between ancient faith and cosmic reality and see them not as contradictions, but as harmonies in a song too vast for any one world to sing alone. The agent dropped to her knees on the chamber floor, not in defeat but in worship, and I joined her there while above us the star maps wheeled in their eternal patterns. And I understood finally that the gospel I'd believed my whole life was even more beautiful than I'd imagined, that the good news wasn't just for one species on one planet, but was the fundamental truth of all existence, that God so loved the cosmos that he gave his only Son, that whosoever believes across all the infinite expressions of consciousness should not perish but have everlasting life, and I wept with joy at the magnificent scale of grace. David's form lingered a moment longer in the chamber's center, his eyes seeming to pierce through time itself to meet mine, with an intimacy that suggested he'd known I would stand here millennia before my birth, that This message had been crafted not just for future generations in abstract, but for me specifically in this exact moment of crisis and choice. And as his image finally dissolved into motes of light that drifted upward like reversed rain, I felt something fundamental shift in my understanding of providence and destiny. The Watcher moved to where David had stood and placed his elongated fingers against a section of wall that looked no different from any other, but responded to his touch by opening like a flower, petals of crystalline stone folding back to reveal an alcove containing what appeared to be a perfect sphere of condensed starlight, pulsing with rhythms that made my heart stutter and synchronize with its cadence, and he lifted it with both hands as though it weighed more than its small size suggested, holding it between us like a priest elevating the host. He spoke then with a gravity that made the air itself seem to thicken, telling us that what we were seeing was a preservation matrix, a technology his people had developed, not through mere scientific advancement, but through millennia of learning to work with the fundamental structures of reality that the Creator had woven into existence, technology that was indistinguishable from divine gift, because all true knowledge ultimately led back to the source of all knowing. The sphere began to brighten in response to our attention, and I realized it was responding not to our physical presence, but to the quality of our consciousness, that it recognized intention and sincerity the way a living being recognizes another. And the Watcher confirmed my intuition by saying that what separated David from other kings of his era was not his military prowess or political skill, but his capacity to remain open to wonder, to kneel before mystery with the same humility he'd shown as a shepherd boy watching stars wheel overhead while his sheep slept. And that openness had made him a suitable vessel for truths that would have shattered more rigid minds. The sphere's light intensified until I had to shield my eyes, but even through closed lids I could see it, could feel it pressing against my consciousness with patient insistence. And the Watcher's voice came from somewhere both near and impossibly distant, saying that I needed to stop trying to understand and simply receive, that the mind could only process information, but the spirit could absorb truth in forms that transcended linguistic structure, and I felt myself surrendering control the way you surrender to sleep after fighting exhaustion too long. Images flooded through me, then not as external visions but as memories that couldn't be mine, yet felt more real than my own childhood. And I saw creation from perspectives I had no framework to contain, watched worlds coalescing from cosmic dust, while songs of such beauty rang through the void that matter itself danced into patterns of increasing complexity, beheld the emergence of consciousness in forms that looked nothing like human, but blazed with the same divine spark that Genesis said God had breathed into Adam's nostrils. I witnessed civilizations rising on planets whose names I could not pronounce, beings of every imaginable configuration learning to love and create and worship, and through it all ran a golden thread of presence that I recognized as the Logos, the Word that John's Gospel said was with God and was God, and through whom all things were made. And I understood, with sudden crystalline clarity, that Jesus was not an afterthought in response to human failure, but the eternal intention around which all creation revolved. The Watcher's voice wove through these visions like a guide's hand on my shoulder, explaining that the incarnation that had happened in Bethlehem was the physical manifestation of a truth that existed before time, that God's nature was self-emptying love that poured itself into creation not from obligation but from the sheer overflow of divine joy, and that when the Son took flesh in Mary's womb, he was not diminishing himself, but revealing what had always been true, that the infinite could embrace the finite without contradiction. Because love transcends the mathematics of limitation, I saw then what David had seen on those ancient hills, the network of conscious life spreading across galaxies like neurons in an incomprehensibly vast brain, each species and civilization a unique note in a symphony that had been playing since the first moment of existence, and Earth's role was not to be the only audience, but to be the place where the composer himself had stepped onto the stage to sing alongside his creation, to show every being everywhere that they were not forgotten in the vastness, but individually known and cherished. The visions began to coalesce around a single focal point, and I found myself watching the crucifixion from an angle I'd never considered, seeing not just the hill of Golgotha, but the way that moment created ripples through dimensions I had no names for, how the death of God in human flesh was felt simultaneously across every world where conscious beings looked up at their skies and wondered if anyone heard their prayers. I saw beings of pure energy and creatures of dense matter both pause in their daily existence, as something fundamental in the structure of reality shifted, as the barrier between created and creator became permeable in a new way, and the Watcher whispered that this was why his people called themselves Watchers, because they had been positioned across creation to witness and record this central event that human history books treated as local religious drama, but that was actually the hinge point upon which all cosmic history turned. The resurrection appeared next, not as resuscitation of a corpse, but as the eruption of new physics into old creation, the first cells of a renewed universe breaking through the dying shell of the old. And I understood why Paul had called Jesus the firstborn of the new creation, why the gospel wasn't just about souls going to heaven, but about heaven and earth merging into something that transcended both original states. The sphere's light began to gentle, and I felt myself being drawn back into my body, which I'd somehow partially left, the agent beside me gasping as though surfacing from deep water, and the Watcher carefully returned the sphere to its alcove while explaining that what we'd experienced was just the barest introduction to truths that would take lifetimes to unpack, that David himself had spent decades integrating what the visitors had shown him and had only managed to encode fragments of it in his psalms. He turned to face us fully, and I saw his alien features transfigured by joy that was unmistakably the same joy I'd felt in moments of deepest worship. And he said the words that would echo in my mind for the rest of my life, that the gospel was not humanity's tribal myth, but the universe's love letter, that every person who'd ever looked at a cross and felt their heart broken open by unexplainable grace was touching the same truth that bound all creation together, and that I was now commissioned to carry this enlarged vision back to a world that desperately needed to know it was not a cosmic accident, but a beloved part of God's infinite family. The chamber suddenly thrummed with a frequency I felt in my teeth, and the Watcher's expression shifted from joy to alarm, his luminous eyes darting upward as though seeing through the tons of stone and earth above us to something approaching from the sky. And he said with quiet urgency that his people had arrived, but so had others who would not understand what they were witnessing, who would interpret rescue as invasion and respond with the violence that fear always generated. The agent was already moving toward the stairs with professional instinct reasserting itself, but the Watcher caught her arm gently and told her that she had a choice now, that she could report what she'd seen through the lens of threat assessment and strategic advantage, or she could become a bridge between worlds, between the military mindset and the recognition that we were about to take our first stumbling steps toward joining a community of worlds that had been waiting for humanity to mature beyond its adolescent aggression. She stood frozen in indecision, and I saw my own internal struggle reflected in her face, the vertigo of having your entire worldview expanded beyond recognition while still being expected to function in the old framework. And the Watcher looked at both of us with compassion that held no judgment, saying that whatever we chose, he would honor because Free will was the most sacred gift the Creator had given to conscious beings, the terrible and beautiful capacity to accept or reject truth without coercion. Above us, the sounds of shouting and running feet echoed down the ancient stairs, and I knew that within moments the hidden chamber would be breached, that soldiers would pour into this holy place with weapons drawn and fingers on triggers, and I had perhaps 30 seconds to decide who I would be in the story that was about to unfold, whether I would be protector or betrayer, bridge or barrier, keeper of mystery or collaborator in its suppression. I made my choice in the heartbeat before the soldiers burst through, stepping forward, to place myself between the Watcher and the descending chaos, and as armed men in tactical gear flooded the chamber with weapons raised and red laser sights painting dots across ancient walls, I felt a strange calm settle over me like a mantle, the certainty that I was exactly where I needed to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do. The Watchers and found my shoulder and squeezed gently, a gesture of gratitude that transcended our different biologies, and he whispered in that language I shouldn't understand, but did that I had chosen correctly, that love always required the risk of standing vulnerable before power, and that this was the pattern Jesus had established on the night of his arrest, when he could have called legions of angels, but instead walked forward to meet his captors. The lead soldier was shouting commands, demanding the aliens step away from the civilians, and I saw the agent who descended with us raise her hands slowly, her face a map of conflicting loyalties, before she turned to her colleagues and said in a voice that shook but held firm that they were making a terrible mistake, that what stood before them was not an enemy, but an answer to questions humanity had been asking since we first built altars to the sky. The chamber's walls began to pulse with accelerating light, and I realized the Watcher's people were not just arriving, but actively connecting with the technology David had helped build millennia ago, and through the ceiling of stone that should have been solid, I saw luminescence gathering like dawn, breaking through impossible barriers, photons that behaved like living things, assembling themselves into a pillar that would serve as both doorway and declaration. The Watcher stepped past me gently, moving toward the center of the chamber where David's recorded message had played, and as he walked, his form began to change, not grotesquely, but with the fluid grace of something revealing its true nature. His skin luminous now, and his eyes like galaxies compressed into human-sized organs of perception, and he raised his arms in a gesture that was simultaneously surrender and blessing. He spoke then, not just to those of us in the chamber, but somehow to a wider audience, and I understood that his words were being heard by his people above, and perhaps transmitted farther still, a message sent across whatever network connected the conscious civilizations he'd shown me in the sphere's visions, and he said that humanity stood at the threshold it had been prepared for, that the violence and fear we were witnessing was birth pain, not death throe, the labor of a species struggling to emerge into a larger reality. The soldiers hadn't fired, and I realized some instinct deeper than training was holding them back, some recognition that what they were witnessing partook of the sacred in ways their briefings hadn't prepared them for, and several had lowered their weapons involuntarily, as though suddenly aware they'd drawn guns in a cathedral. The pillar of light intensified until the entire chamber blazed with radiance that should have blinded, but instead clarified, and I saw descending through stone and earth as though matter was merely suggestion, a craft of such elegant geometry it seemed grown rather than built, its surfaces flowing with script that matched the celestial language interwoven with Hebrew on the chamber walls. And the Watcher looked back at me one final time with eyes that held both farewell and promise. He moved toward me with deliberate steps, and from somewhere within his form produced an object I hadn't seen him carrying, a fragment of crystal no larger than my thumb, that pulsed with the same rhythms I'd felt from the preservation sphere, and he pressed it into my palm while curling my fingers around it with surprising tenderness, whispering that I was now a keeper of the covenant that bound all creation. that this fragment was attuned to my specific consciousness and would help me remember what I'd experienced when the world's noise threatened to drown out transcendent truth. I felt the crystal's warmth seep into my skin, and deeper still, into whatever part of me had recognized truth in his impossible words. And he said that the task ahead would be harder than any battle, because I would have to convince people to expand their categories of possible, to believe that God's love was vaster than their theology, and that Jesus was not diminished by being revealed as the center of cosmic story, rather than merely human, and that I would face ridicule from skeptics and anger from believers who felt their exclusive claim to divine attention threatened. But he reminded me that David had faced similar isolation after his encounters, that every prophet and mystic who'd glimpsed the larger pattern had walked through seasons of misunderstanding, and that I would not be alone, because the spirit that had hovered over creation's first waters and overshadowed Mary in Nazareth was the same presence that would whisper courage when I doubted my own memories. The pillar of light enveloped him completely, and I felt the air pressure change, as though reality was inhaling, and his final words reached me not through my ears, but directly into my heart, telling me that every act of love I performed from this day forward would ripple across dimensions I couldn't see, that every moment of choosing mercy over judgment would strengthen the web connecting all conscious beings, and that the simple human prayer I spoke in my bedroom was heard simultaneously across every world, where creatures looked up and wondered if anyone was listening. The ascension happened in a rush of wind that smelled of ozone, and something sweeter I had no reference for, and the watcher's form dissolved upward into the light, like sugar stirred into water, present, then absent, then somehow present in a new way that permeated rather than occupied space, and the craft rose through stone as effortlessly as it had descended, leaving behind walls that still glowed with residual energy and soldiers who stood with slack jaws and forgotten weapons. I stood in the sudden silence, clutching the crystal fragment and feeling its pulse synchronize with my heartbeat. And I knew with unshakable certainty that I had been changed at a level deeper than belief or opinion, that I had been altered in my fundamental structure the way Saul became Paul on the Damascus Road, and that my life's trajectory had been irrevocably bent toward a horizon I was only beginning to perceive. The agent approached me slowly, and I saw tears on her face cutting tracks through dust, and she asked in a broken whisper what we were supposed to do now, how we were supposed to return to normal life after standing in the place where heaven and earth exchanged vows, and I told her what the Watcher's presence had taught me, that we were supposed to live as though the gap between sacred and ordinary had been abolished, because that was the truth the Incarnation had established, that every meal could be Eucharist, and every conversation could be prayer, and every choice could be an act of worship when performed with awareness that we moved through a universe drenched in divine attention. And she nodded as though I'd confirmed something she already suspected but needed permission to believe. And together we turned toward the stairs that would lead us back up into a world that hadn't changed at all, except that we had changed utterly, and would spend the rest of our lives translating what we'd experienced into forms that others might receive, becoming ourselves. The letters of a gospel, written not in ink but in transformed lives, carriers of the truth that we are not alone, that we have never been alone, and that the love holding galaxies in their courses knows each of us by name. Have you ever felt that your purpose was waiting to be discovered? Subscribe to continue this journey into the mysteries of faith in the cosmos.